Hello everyone and welcome back to Nate's Vintage Trains. In today's video, we will be discussing the scales of live steam. Now, last week I already did a video about the certain gauges related, gauge being the width between the rails, scale being the actual scaled down ratio for a model. You might see on a model that it has a ratio of 1 to whatever size it might be. For the 1 real inch equals this many scale inches, or feet, meters, for some of you international folk, whatever it might be. So with that, please consider subscribing. I post similar content each week. I'll do more live steam explained content in the future because there's some meets coming up very soon. So with that, thank you for choosing to watch this video, and do enjoy. Thank you. Okay, before we get into things, let's establish the standards. So the main standards in the United States for ride-on scales and live steam trains are as follows. The very least commonly used 2.5 inch gauge, not very popular in the US, and I haven't had much experience around it, so I will be omitting it from this video. 3.5 inch gauge, or about 1/16 scale, about 3/4 inches to the foot for standard gauge. Standard gauge is 56.5 inches in real life, and railroads have different gauges within the real life examples. 3-foot gauge, 2-foot gauge if you're in the state of Maine, or whatever industrial railway there is. Some trolleys even use 3-foot 6-inch gauge, but again, we'll get back into that in just a moment. 1-inch scale, which is 1 inch equals 12 inches in scale, 1 inch equals 1 foot, is 4.75 inch gauge, or 4 3/4. Then 7.5 inch gauge has two different standards here. 7.5 or 7 1/4. 7 1/4 is generally for 1.5 inches to the foot scale, which is 1/8, and then 7.5 inch gauge for standard gauge has about generally either 1.5 or 1.6 inch scale, which is 1 to 7.5 ratio scale. It's just a little bit larger than the 1/8 or 1.5 inch scale. With that out of the way, let's go through each of the gauges and the different scales related to them. So we will start by 3.5 inch gauge, then 4 3/4 inch gauge, and then 7.5 inch gauge. So let's start off with 3.5 inch gauge. Standard gauge for 3.5 in scale is about 1/16, or 3/4 inches equals 1 foot in scale. So there aren't many variations besides standard gauge that I know to exist. For 3-foot gauge, the scale would be about 1/12, which is the next size higher, and I have seen plans for a main 2-foot gauge locomotive in 3.5 inch gauge, but for 1.5 or 1.6 scale. I'd like to try to find it again, but it's been some years since I've ever seen that design, and I wonder if one was actually ever built. I'd love to see it, let me tell you. I must say, I find the 2.5 inch gauge and 3.5 inch gauge flying technique for trying to get into the controls of an engine fascinating. Now for 4 3/4 inch gauge. Standard gauge is about 1/12 scale, or 1 inch equals 1 foot. A little obvious there. But I have seen narrow gauge for 1.5 or 1.6 inch scale. This is about 3-foot gauge for this 4 3/4 inch gauge track and scale. Now, I've seen just one example of this, and actually I have operated it, and you can check out some of my playlists, see if you could try and find it. But most commonly it is standard gauge, so you aren't going to find much different besides that. And I do not know of any examples for 2.5-inch scale engines in 4 3/4-inch gauge, which is about 2-foot scale gauge. Now, let's go into the most common and biggest gauge of them all, 7.5-inch gauge, or if you're in the Northeast, 7.25-inch gauge. Now, this is standard gauge for 1/8 or 1.5-inch to the foot scale, sometimes 1.6-inch scale too for 7.5-inch gauge specifically. I do not know why the discrepancy exists. I tried to explain that. I might do it in another video. But anyway, so standard gauge, by far, in 7.5-inch is the most common type of engine, in my experience, in the United States, for this live steam and ride-on-train hobby, which is understandable. It is very sizable. You could do a lot of stuff with it. It's workable, and it's still comfortable to ride at the same time. But anyway, there's so many videos that I've posted of this that I could just go on and on for ages. But we're describing scales here in relation to the gauges. Now, for a 3-foot gauge, this happens to be, well, I'd say the second most popular example for 7.5 or live steam in general. 3-foot gauge for 7.5 works out to about 2.5 inches to the foot scale, or 1 to 4.8. That is the scale ratio, the last one, by the way. This I have seen and operated a few examples of. There's a whole host of engines that have been made, produced currently for commercial purposes, custom engines, and even, probably the most well-known of this size for 7.5-inch gauge is the rather massive RMI Railworks products. They make mostly 2.5-inch scale products for the 3-foot gauge, like I said, as well as some 3 3/4-inch scale. 3 3/4 inches to the foot is about 2-foot gauge in 7.5 inches gauge for the scale. However, RMI Railworks isn't the only maker of 3 3/4-inch scale, or 4-inch scale, some people like to just round it up to. There are, of course, many examples of home-built contraptions and beautiful steam engines, including this consist. RMI Railworks products tend to be rather large machines. I've operated 2 of these steam locomotives, and there's a lot more diesel/battery electric engines that have been produced as well. Not only was it by RMI, I must give credit to a person that I recently met, Steve Ilson, who created many of the original designs that RMI would end up adopting and using in their line of products. So that's a rough go-round at 7.5-inch gauge. However, some people like to try to do very interesting things. I've seen rail bikes in 7.5-inch, as well as a shout out to Nicholas from Riverside Live Steamers, who happened to have an idea to use an RC car to pull himself around in Orange County more than once.
And somehow staying on the rails.
I gotta steer it too.
There's one railroad which I must mention here that I forgot to in the last video as an honorable mention for another live steam gauge. That happens to be the Mesa Grande Western Railroad. This is a 9-inch gauge railway with narrow 3-foot gauge equipment. Now, 9-inch gauge, if I remember correctly, is about 3-foot narrow gauge for standard gauge 15-inch railway. Yeah, it sounds about right. The ratio would work. So this is quite the extensive layout, and some person was really dedicated to making their own gauge equipment, track, locomotives, everything to operate on this railway. I'd like to visit it someday. Many of my friends have, so heck, might even see a video in the future, but we'll see. Only time will tell. Anyhow, thank you so much for watching this video. If you do like this sort of content, I have more live Steam explained ideas on the way, but next week we will be at Maricopa Live Steamers for their 2024 Winterfest Fun Run meet. See how that goes, see what we can see, of course. It's all a bunch of fun rail fanning on miniature trains. You get to see a lot more variety, too, than with the big stuff. And you could actually participate and run it without having to have much training, if at all. Except steam locomotives. That's a different story. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Again, consider like, share, subscribe, all the good YouTube stuff, and until next time, this is Nate's Vintage Trains. Keep it old school, Jesus loves you, and God bless you all.